This is Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm L'Shawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching. Today we are going to look at lessons of winter. We have done episodes on the lesson of fall and lessons of summer. So we were thinking of lessons of winter 2 weekends ago when we got this big snowstorm. It was on a Saturday. I had dropped off my daughter and I came back and I knew that I had to shovel my way back into the house. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to just take this time to shovel the driveway and the sidewalk. And in that time, I was able to let go of all the thought, worries, things that were spinning around in my head and appreciate the silence that comes with a snowstorm, that unique muffled sounds that comes with it. Those are some things that I think about with lessons of winter. We have talked about lessons of summer and lessons of fall, so why not tackle lessons of winter? Eryn, what comes to mind when you hear the phrase lessons of winter?
So much. I have my cat Cosmo behind me here on a blanket, and that is what makes me think of lessons of winter, where you're taking care of yourself and maybe rooting inward. Soft blankets always come to mind as imagery when I think of the soft blanket of snow or the soft tangible blankets that we use in our own homes. So that level of warmth that can be provided in a season that's typically, especially where we live, very cold, there's something significant about that. And there's something that I have a lot of gratitude for and appreciation for, that there are ways to access warmth in our own homes, within our own resources during the winter. And then the other thing, last winter, starting in the new year, I had been in that car accident and had that significant surgery to repair my wrist. And so I was forced to really winter. I know there's even a book called Wintering that people have been reading and really enjoying. But I was really forced to kind of take it slower, be at home a little bit more. And through that process, surprisingly and paradoxically, I was able to really focus in on a creative project, which is the book that I wrote and that's coming out. And so I think during that time, I was concerned my own level to be able to, function at what I was functioning at. And I wasn't, right? I was recovering. And yet, by taking that time to recover and taking that time slower, I was able to put forth a lot of creative effort, which I feel really grateful for as well. So while winter may mean slowing down or going indoors for some things, it does have these beautiful gifts that it brings. And I think that through that slowing down, there is the gift of creativity or the gift of relationships or the gift of just, seeing my cat back here, Cosmo, who is such a lovable guy. So those are my initial impressions of winter. L'Shawn, what about you?
I think the same thing when I contemplate the lessons of winter, that slowing down that comes with the season. One is, as you were saying, like in Colorado, it can be cold. Right now, we have kind of a warm spell, I would say. Later this week, it's supposed to get colder. And I think that when things are covered in snow, when the streets can be slippery, the sidewalks can be slippery, we are reminded of the importance of being careful and being mindful. I become more aware of what my feet are doing when I'm walking on what could be slippery sidewalks with the ice and the slush. And then when you're driving in those conditions, you're mindful of the feeling of the wheels against the asphalt. I'm more aware of the sounds around me. I'm more aware of the feeling of the steering wheel. Is it pulling a little bit because it's, the slush is grabbing the tires? And so you're more aware of the mechanical nature of things, and more aware of, how you're walking and that feeling that you get when you slip on ice, that feeling of vulnerability that comes with being in situations where the conditions are not very safe. That's one thing that I think about when I think about winter, is that necessity for being mindful, that necessity for not being distracted. You're in a snowstorm, driving in a snowstorm. You're not going to be thinking about what you're going to eat for dinner. You're like, you got white knuckles, 10 and 2, and you're driving, and you're aware of the other cars. I'm very aware of how far the cars are from me. And what it does is it puts me in a very present state. I am in the present moment. And I want to go back to that scene of me shoveling the driveway, and how you get into this kind of rhythmic, methodical movement. You're shoveling the snow and putting it in a pile on the side. And I'm shoveling snow, putting it in a pile, and I'm just focusing on the feeling of the snow as it falls on my face and on my head, because I didn't have a hat at the time. And I'm focusing on the sound of the wind, and I'm focusing on the scraping sound of the shovel hitting the snow and then scooping up the ice. And I'm not thinking about what I'm going to eat for lunch, or what I said to my daughter an hour ago, or worried about anything. I'm in the present. That's a lesson that I take from winter, the power of the present, and how important it is to be mindful of those things, and how we take for granted the cars moving well in clear conditions. But at the same time, when you're in not so clear conditions, you're in storm conditions, you're much more aware of your car. You're much more aware of the sound. You're much more aware of the other cars around you. And it gives you a chance to get those heightened senses and to be in the present. So that is definitely a lesson. And I think that slowing down that you talked about, Eryn, that slowing down and that time to recover, as you were in last winter, where you were recovering from the injuries from the accident. I think that's just kind of the nature of winter. It is a time of hibernation for some animals. It's a time of gathering around the hearth, eating good comfort foods, being wrapped in a blanket. So those are some of the things that I think about when I think about the lessons of winter. Anything coming up for you, Eryn?
Just as you were talking, how well you described the imagery of it all. And we talked about other seasons, summer and fall, and now we're in winter, and the imagery of fall and what that meant. And, the imagery of winter here that you're painting a picture of is one that's quite peaceful. So when I was listening there, it's like, this feels really good. And I think when we can hang on to some of those feelings that sometimes may be fleeting, such as that feeling of promise of the slowing down and the feeling of being present in the wintertime, we can use those as exercises or tools moving forward into other seasons and into other days as well. And I think with winter, I always think of the quietness and the mutedness that you spoke to earlier on in the episode. And I also think to the physical activity that happens, especially being in Colorado with ice skating and skiing being fairly accessible, although skiing is way pricey these days. But some of those more winter sports that are getting people outdoors in community and active, I think is a really neat thing too. And while we can still be slowing down and in hibernation mode, for me, one of the lessons of winter this year has been a little bit different from the past year, where it was a little bit more restorative and slow. And that has been the activity of coaching a girls basketball team and the vibrancy that comes with that, and being indoors in an indoor basketball court or on a court that is quite warm, right? It feels like summer in a way. It feels like very much a buzz. And I think for me, that has been a way to keep me balanced this winter, going between that hibernation mode, the kind of settling in, turning inward, but also now having to be very present and very outward as the coach, and being very much in the game and mindful of what's going on. And so I have enjoyed that shift to my winter, and I can see why people all across the world, and especially in the US, have indoor winter sports that keeps people active and connected, but also as a way to stay warm too in the colder climate. So that's a very different approach to winter for me this year than it was last year. And there are gifts with each of those. I had the gift of creativity last year. I wouldn't say my creativity is very high right now, but I do have the gift of more community through this experience of coaching, for instance, or the gift of helping people learn something new, right? Like these things are gifts that I think winter provides a unique opportunity for that maybe some of the other seasons don't hold in the same mystical and helpful and healing way. That's what's also coming up to me is like these hidden treasures of the season of winter and how meaningful they are in my life. L'Shawn, what's meaningful to you this winter?
Well, while you were talking, I was thinking about the idea of two things being true at once. So we're talking about slowing down. We're talking about the muted nature of being out when there's a snowstorm or being surrounded by snow. And then you brought in the activity and the energy and the vibrancy of sports, of coaching a basketball team. So I think there's several things going on that can exist at the same time. So that's one of the things that I was thinking about when I was listening to you talk, that two things can be true at the same time. There can be that quiet, restful, restorative nature of winter. And at the same time, there's the excitement and frenetic nature of winter where you have movement and outdoor sports. And you also have ice skating and you have sledding and you have skiing, and there's all kinds of things that we can do and we can be active. And community was another thing that you brought up, which with a new year coming and new possibilities, new beginnings, because beginning of January is in winter. And so that's part of winter as well, new beginnings. Often we think about new beginnings in spring because things are starting to bloom and things are starting to get, the green is starting to pop out, and you start thinking about birth and that kind of thing with bunnies and Easter is what I'm thinking about in the spring. But one thing that came to mind when you were talking, Eryn, was the idea of new beginnings, because that is definitely part of winter, the new year. It happens in Western culture. We have that. And then also the Chinese New Year happens in winter as well. There's just so much, I think, that is coming up for me in terms of like gifts that you're mentioning, the gifts of these different seasons, of the gifts of winter. And what comes to mind is appreciation and reflection. Because often when we're looking at an experience that we're having, when we reflect, it allows us to see gifts, lessons. That's all part of reflection. Often we find lessons and gifts, opportunities even, when we look back at something and reflect. Sometimes online, you can be doing that as well, but I find my own personal experiences that those are things that come up upon reflection. And so if we look at the nature of the weather in winter, where there's reflective surfaces. So if you think about ice, for example, or things freezing is another thing that comes to mind as well. And what's happening underneath? I was going on a walk. I think it was Sunday. I was walking, and there was a kind of like a creek or something, and it was frozen. But when I looked through the thin layer of ice, you could see that the water was still flowing underneath. And I often think about what's happening underneath the ground. We know that the trees don't have leaves, but we know that part of the tree is dormant. We know that in spring, things are going to start budding and we're going to start to see the green that comes out. But that's been working under the surface. So it's exciting to think about what's underneath the ground. Right now, the grass looks really brown and lifeless, but I know that if I dig under, there's going to be a lot of life and a lot of things going on underneath there that will start to come up and manifest when spring comes along and it gets warmer. So that's one thing also that I think about is what's happening underneath. Any thoughts coming to you, Eryn?
again, all that imagery, I just feel so much at peace. And I could walk there with you and see you observing like so clearly what was going on underneath the water. And I love that point that you've made about, there are things we don't see that are going on, right? Whether that's within people's own lives, underground, like you mentioned, and even all the energies and much more beyond comprehension. So I think that the way that you frame that is so helpful when I think about winter. And if I am slowing down during winter, there's probably a lot of internal things going on or something that people are not seeing, hence, which led to creativity last year. And so I think it's a call in my mind to be less judgmental of others and what's on the surface and allowing them to show up slower in winter or whatever they need to do to then move into a new season in their own lives. And obviously this really resonates with me in grief and loss. And I guess I'll just leave it there. But that's such a huge part of it, right? Is how we kind of unwind ourselves through the grieving process into our new self. And a lot of people are not seeing what's really happening there. So I love this idea of the unseen. And then I love you pointing out that you can hold two things to be true that might be very different from each other or might have dissonance, and that's okay and necessary. And I hope that we can get to a space in our lives collectively where both of whatever's being held is from a place of compassion and curiosity and observation. And that goes back to how you described how you looked underneath the ice. It was very much like this compassionate, gentle approach that was grounded in curiosity and observation. So those lessons also this winter, I think, are really invaluable to hold in terms of going back to those roots of holding space for people with curiosity and compassion and our role as coaches. So for those who are professional coaches out there or counselors, how we can also help people understand themselves through that process by our own observations and our own tools that we've amassed over the course of a year. Because, in our work, it is a year-round flow and there's some ebbs and flows to it. But I think winter is a time where people often seek extra human support because sometimes due to various circumstances and just the general nature of the season, it can feel really isolating. And, you don't have to feel that way to create change in your life. Having that feeling may be a helpful tool to tap into, but you can also seek out support services, seek out community building activities. There's a lot of volunteer opportunities in the winter. There's a lot of painting or art or different types of activities in communities. Also just having conversations with friends or board games tend to come up a lot this time of year as well is a way to keep connected in a way that feels good and is gentle and is not overly stimulating. Because I don't think winter is truly a time for that, although I do see that in the basketball space, so who knows. So yeah, I appreciate winter deeply. I always find that I struggle going into the earlier part of winter because the days are so dark, right? It's so not much sunlight. And now that's shifting. And that's a change that's also within the same season, right? Within winter, you have the increased darkness and then the lessening of the darkness. And I think that gets back to your point, L'Shawn, about holding both truths, right? Winter is a promise of the complexity of it all, that there will be darker times for all of us. There will be more times filled with light, potentially. And I think I really like that push and pull of what winter represents. So I'll pass it back to you, L'Shawn. What's going on?
That's a really beautiful narration of the different things that we can observe in winter, especially with the last thing that you talked about with the shorter days where there's longer times of darkness. And then we're getting into the shifting of longer periods of light. And we're starting to see, and I love the word that you use, promise, that there's promise in winter as well. And I see this in a lot of the seasons, actually, that promise and also the transitions, because something that you brought up, I didn't really have in mind, but there's that transition in winter as well. That's starting out with winter solstice, which is the shortest day of the year, where you have the start of longer nights and where it's getting dark at like 4 and you're driving in the dark and you're like, what's going on here? And then you start to notice around, I would say, end of December and New Year, you start to see, oh, it's not dark and it's 4:30. Oh, it's 5:30 and it's not dark. I start to notice that, oh, these things are, this is not, it's not permanent. The darkness is not permanent. And so you are seeing changes and shifting, very subtle. It's very subtle changes that are happening. And if you are preoccupied with how things are going in your life, which is fine, but it can be easily missed. They can be easily missed, those subtle shifts in the amount of light that we have to enjoy during the winter months. So that's a really good point, that there are transitions and things are shifting slowly and subtly in winter. And one thing that came to mind when you were talking about, you brought back basketball, and I was thinking about indoor sports, and I'm thinking about how it is when you're inside and you're doing an activity and then you go outside, and how there's that transition from the warmth and the vibrancy of inside, and it's really, really bright lights. Because I remember in the gym, the lights are just so bright. I don't know why the lights are so bright.
I wish they were not so bright.
and things are, it's really spacious. There's a lot of space, and you're surrounded by people, who are cheering or who are watching the action happening on the court. And then you get ready to go outside. And if it's winter, then you're bundling up. But if you're a player, you're coming down from that, you're sweaty. I remember when I was younger and I took basketball, and I would just dread going outside because I was really hot and sweaty, and then going outside and being cold. It's like the two extremes, right? So you have that indoor warmth and the expansion and the moving and the movement, and then you go outside. And if you're anything like me, when I go outside in the cold, I scrunch up. I get like really small, so less surface area there, and then I can stay warmer. And I appreciate, the warm air coming from the car, and putting my hands against the vent and warming up. So it's the warming up that comes with leaving the cold outside, coming in, and that thawing and that warming up, that difference between the two, and being able to see how our bodies react or how we move differently. That's interesting to me. And I also think about, again, the two things can be true. You can be warm, and outside it's like freezing, and you can hear the sounds of freezing, like the hollow sound of the wind. Like there's nothing like the sound of winter wind. There's something so, I don't know, everything just seems so I guess hollow. That's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah. Well, it kind of sounds like in It's the Unknown, the song from Disney, Frozen.
Frozen, yeah.
The way they kind of make the wind sound of Frozen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very different sound than the howling wind in fall, because you have the rustling of the leaves. When you're in winter, there are no leaves rustling. And so it's a very different sound. And I want to go back to what we had talked about, the lessons of fall, because one of the things we talked about was our senses. And I think that winter really does that too, because you've got the sense of touch where you're feeling that cold, or you're feeling the warmth of a fire, you're feeling the warmth of a heater or a blanket, the soft, comforting feeling of a blanket. The sounds of winter, the crunch of the ice underneath your feet or your boots, or the scraping of the shovel against a sidewalk or against the snow. It's a very different sound. The feel of it too, the feel of it when you're shoveling, and your muscles too. Like, what does that feel like when you're putting that extra power or force? So there's a lot of aspects of winter that stimulate the senses, and all of this. Smell, smell, the smell of snow, the smell of a nice cup of tea, or the smell of some comfort food, because comfort food is often part of winter too. It's kind of part of keeping warm. There's so many things that we can learn from winter, and one of them, what's coming up for me right now in this conversation, is just our senses. There's also sight as well. How about you, Eryn?
Yeah, I agree. I think being in tune with those senses and just taking a moment to check through the list like you did, and what's resonating with, each of you, I think that makes a lot of sense to do as a mindful activity, and a more active one than some, right? So that's typically how I like my mindfulness activities like that. So I'll definitely be doing a scan of the senses, but I've brought up music multiple times, I think, on the podcast. And so like the music of winter, I tend to get maybe a little more bluegrassy in the winter than other seasons. I played tons of Christmas music on the piano leading up to, Christmas. And then at this point now that we're going into February, and like there's a little bit more of that spring peppiness, especially today. In the past couple of days, it's warmed up tremendously here. That's when I go back to like that high energy workout mix that I have on my Spotify or things like that. So it is interesting too how music for me plays such an interesting part in the seasons and what I listen to and used to listen to. I growing up on a farm, country music was on the radio a lot, but it's interesting when now there'll be like a few weeks in June where I only want to listen to country music because that's what my kind of internal system was used to. And I think that's the other thing here too. We remember these sensory things because of the way that they're imparted onto our memories. And so, when I think of these things for winter and how they relate to the specific season, I think it's a nice way to have some self-awareness, because it for me, by rooting into, okay, what's happening with me this winter, what happened with me that last winter, I feel much more self-aware about what was going on versus if I would have said what happened in January versus what happened in January. Like, I don't know. When I have the winter or the season to root into, I can play around with the senses more, like you brought into the picture, L'Shawn. And then I feel like I just remember things more because of the way that my mind can recall the information, because there's a hook there with the actual season, the seasonal component. So I think that's really neat, and why the seasons and the natural rhythm of life is so significant. And I guess, with the natural rhythm of life, it's making me think of today with the loss of my grandmother, who was 93 and moving into her next stage, and my grief around that. I was thinking about this. Most of the people I have lost to death losses have been in the summer. I don't have as many winter funeral memories as I do in other seasons. So this will be interesting to see how, that plays a part of my memories to come with just the term winter or the season winter in general. So yeah.
Yeah. So I feel compelled to, of course, offer my condolences for your loss and really acknowledge the difference there, that your death losses have been in the summer. How different must that have been, especially since summer is a bright and kind of jovial time. People are out, more, and then winter, and then having this death loss and winter, and what that means, and how that can compare, and to see what lessons there are in that as well. Another thing that came up while you were talking is the idea of traditions, and how those traditions can be anchors for us in different seasons. And everyone is going to have different traditions. And it could be similar to what other people are doing. Like, for example, in a culture, we might have similar traditions related to Christmas, related to New Year's Eve. One tradition that we have in the Western culture, American culture, is New Year's resolutions. And so, those are some things that come to mind when you were talking about that. Traditions and things that we do on an annual basis that can allow us to compare. It's not just January and January, it's what we did for my New Year's resolution last year, my New Year's resolution this year, something to compare, something to measure growth and measure change as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be growth. It could just be change. Where were my New Year's resolutions last year? Where are my New Year's resolutions this year? What does that say about where I am currently in my life? That kind of thing. So that's something that came up for me. Any other thoughts that you have, Eryn?
I think so. I think I'm circling on a coaching nugget of wisdom that is inspired by what you talked about with the senses. Mm-hmm. Just love that. Going through all of the 5 plus many other senses that we don't talk about as much, but using that as a mindfulness exercise, maybe when you step outside and really hearing what's around you, seeing what's around you, feeling, maybe tasting the air, those sorts of things. A good way to tap into the natural cycle of what's going on the natural end of your lifespan, and how that relates to where you're at right now.
Yeah, I would like to take one from you, actually. What are some of the gifts that you have found in this season of winter? And maybe take some time to think about aspects of winter and where the gifts lie in those parts of winter. Thanks for joining us for Coaching as Benevolence. I'm L'Shawn with Michelle's Sage Place, Positive Intelligence Coaching.
And I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings, Grief and Loss Coaching.
Have a benevolent day.